All right, I want to say welcome to everyone. It's that time of year again, time to vote on constitutional amendments, everyone's favorite thing when they go to the ballot box. To help with that, we're having this webinar where we'll review some of the things, but we also have a host of wonderful people to help us. I am Stephen Procopio. I'm the president of the Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana, a nonprofit, nonpartisan state policy group and watchdog. And with me, I have Melinda DeLotte, our research director, but we also have three wonderful panelists to help us out. We have Barry Erwin, CEO of our sister organization, the Council for Better Louisiana, better known as CABLE. We also have Jan Moller, that is basically like us, does public policy, but with a focus on how it affects Louisiana's low to moderate income family. And then we have Daniel Erspamer, the CEO of the Pelican Institute for Public Policy, with a focus on the benefits of individual liberty and free enterprise. It's just sort of my way I think about it is we're all on the same street. Maybe one of us lives one or two houses to the right and one of us lives one or two houses to the left, but basically in the same neighborhood. So on this, we have 8 amendments that we're going to try and go through. There are 4 on the October ballot, and then there are 4 on the November ballot, but we're going to try and bite them all out this time. I will do a quick summary of each one. It is a painfully short summary, almost to be inaccurate, but I want to make sure we have plenty of time. And then Melinda will start asking questions of our panelists, just kind of get their opinions. If you have questions, this is a little different than our other webinars. If you have questions, ask them as soon as possible, particularly we're going to try and take them in the order of the amendment. So if you have questions about the first amendment, try and get them in so we can try and answer it then, as opposed to waiting all to the end and we can't remember which amendment we're on. But we will go back if we have to, but if you can get them in, ask them while you can. So with that, I will start with the amendments. I'm going to pull up our PowerPoint. Y'all can all see that? Okay. So this is the ballot language that you're seeing, and that's what we're pulling up here. The ballot language sometimes can be difficult to digest. Overall, this is an amendment that would clarify that the government cannot take donations from non-governmental sources, nonprofits, businesses to conduct elections. You could still do, registration drives, but you cannot actually use it to conduct elections. This comes about from really the 2020 election when we were in COVID, and you have nonprofits that were helping donate, masks and things like that to help. And then there is some concern that creates undue influence, and so there's been several states that have tried to do this. This actually. Well, let me leave it there and see what our panelists have to say.
Okay, so I think this is probably the one that's really just about Mark Zuckerberg. But we'll let y'all explain this. I know Cable is the only one among the organizations that has taken a direct position. So Barry, you get to start first and explain why Cable is in opposition to this amendment.
Well, first and foremost, I guess, Steve and I go around saying the same thing. And I say it to all the groups we talk to. On a lot of issues, we take sort of a purist approach to the degree that we can with the Constitution. So sometimes that means whether you like this idea or you don't like that idea, we kind of try and look at it through the lens of the Constitution. So I just kind of say that, to start with. Obviously, this is an issue that a lot of states have been interested in. 24 states. It appears passed something like this already. We've tried 3 times here, and I think it passed a couple of times. It got vetoed a couple of times. So this is like the 4th iteration of it. But this time it's in a constitutional amendment. All the other times it was in statute. Really, all the research we've done around the country seems to suggest every other state that has something like this has put it in statute. And so, I think it's fair for the legislature to weigh in and make a decision, about whether to do this or not. We just don't think it belongs in the Constitution. This looks like statutory language. It was statutory language. We think it should still be statutory language if the legislature wants to do that. So we just don't think it should be in the Constitution.
And to be clear, this was Mark Zuckerberg set up a foundation after, like in the 2020 election cycle, that was donating money, giving out grants to various institutions that run elections. Louisiana initially had some elections officials that applied for it, and then they pulled back those applications, and no money actually ever flowed to Louisiana. So I just wanted to spell that out. But Jan, I'm going to go next to you to see if the Budget Project has a specific feeling or sense about how y'all are interested in this amendment.
Well, first of all, thank you to PAR for putting this on and for the great work that you guys do on the constitutional amendments. All of us on this panel put out our own guides, but PAR's is really the gold standard. You've been doing this for a long time, and before I was in this role, I used your information when I went to the polls. On this particular one, I agree with Barry. I mean, this is something that certainly should be in statute, not in the Constitution. The reason it's on the ballot is because the author who had tried to get this banned in statute kept getting vetoed by the governor who, of course, isn't going to be here come January 8th. So, but this grew out of this big political debate that grew from, one man losing the 2020 presidential election and deciding that to raise issues about election integrity, and that somehow if a foundation supplies masks and personal protective equipment, that's an assault on election integrity. Louisiana does a lot of things wrong, but we do elections well in this state. There is no evidence that there's been any chicanery in our elections process. And so this is, again, if the legislature wants to ban this, I think that's for the legislature to decide. But Barry's right, it doesn't belong in the Constitution.
Okay, Daniel, your chance to weigh in. I guess there should be some background here in the fact that there are disagreements about whether these kinds of donations are currently allowed. It seems as though the Secretary of State's office and the Attorney General's office seem to believe, because we don't have explicit language allowing it in law, that it is already currently not allowed. A lot of other lawyers disagree. Pelican didn't take a position, but can you sort of walk through your thought process on it?
Yeah, absolutely. This is an issue that is on the minds of a lot of voters. And, Jan certainly points out individuals perhaps concerned with election fraud in the last election. But the truth is, we've had 3 or 4 national elections in a row where one side or the other has accused the other of voter fraud. So this is a concern, I know, that depending on the election cycle we're in, is a concern of one side or another. So I think, to Jan's and Barry's point, this has come through the legislature a few times. A couple of things I'll add that I think are worth noting in this. The first is, elections are guaranteed funding in the Constitution. It's one of the handful of things that will get what it needs to do funding. To the extent there's been contraction or changes in the execution of the election operations, it's been because of shifts of population, and I'll give a plug here for folks to volunteer and sign up to be election workers. The Secretary of State's office needs more people. And if you're concerned about this, if you're interested in elections, this is a good chance to get involved and help solve some of these problems. So, I think the issue is really relevant and pertinent to a lot of people. It's had overwhelming support a couple of times in the legislature. I would agree in part, though, with Barry and Jan that, this is something that is just a great example of some of the challenges with our Constitution as a whole, is that often issues end up in the Constitution that really do belong in statute. So, I think from our point of view, as make no secret, and certainly we've worked with PAR and others to talk about the reforms and changes that are needed to our Constitution as a whole to get it back to a document that really represents a Constitution. In the meantime, voters are going to have to decide, is this important enough for them to put in the Constitution one way or the other, or should the next legislature come back with certainly another governor and a different set of individuals and take this on. But I think I'll close by saying it's important not to dismiss again questions around, and I would agree, by the way, with Jan. I think elections are one thing Louisiana does pretty well by and large. So this is not a local concern in terms of integrity. But I think there are realistic questions that should be asked about what should be allowed moving forward. And, this is a policy that deserves some debate.
And we did get a question from someone who is watching, asking if this amendment would somehow affect the nonprofits that work on elections. I'm assuming they ask if it's going to affect the nonprofits adversely, the ones that work with hard to reach populations. I think that's about getting voters to the polls and registration drives, and this shouldn't affect any of that. This is about the administration of elections directly, but please correct me if anybody thinks there is a way that this could adversely affect nonprofits doing outreach and
Right.
voter registration stuff.
I think the answer is almost certainly no. And I say that as not being a lawyer, but I think a plain reading of this, it's pretty clear what this would prohibit, and it's not that.
But Jan did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. So
Nice. All righty. Great discussion on the first one. Let's keep it up, assuming we have enough time. So let's go to second amendment on the October ballot. This one is another byproduct of really what came out of COVID, and it has to do with the right to worship in a church or other similar place of worship. This really comes out some activities that happened in Baton Rouge during COVID. You had a pastor that defied some of the restrictions and was arrested and charged. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court. They eventually found that his right to worship was violated. However, there are some questions in terms of what the appellate courts and even some of the dissenting judges say. So this would add, we already have a right to worship in the Constitution, but this would add the right to worship in a church or similar situations. It could be a mosque or a synagogue. And it would also apply the strictest level of scrutiny, saying this is a fundamental right, and so that you would need any restriction would be presumed unconstitutional, and that you would have to have very narrow, tailored restriction. So with that, turn it back over to Melinda.
Okay, well, this is one that we had to talk to about 4 lawyers to be able to understand the legal implications of this. So with that, I'm going to let Daniel talk about it first.
thanks.
Our move.
None of the organizations involved took a direct position on this. I think the Budget Project has some thoughts, but Daniel, if you want to sort of lay out maybe what you see as the pros and cons of this one.
Yeah, so sort of picking up where the last left off about what belongs, what are the issues or structures that belong in the Constitution. This seems clearly to be a fit of yes. These are the kinds of questions one way or another that deserve constitutional scrutiny. I think the question, again, to your point, Melinda, there's some confusion or disagreement, maybe is the better way to put it, among what the current Constitution says, some dissents from judges as the case made its way through the courts the last time around. But I think vast majorities of Louisiana voters would agree that the current Constitution language does protect this right, but we saw that come under some question during the executive orders, during the lockdowns. So this is an effort by the legislature to clarify this is a right that shall not be taken away. So I think my suspicion is a lot of voters are going to agree with the language of this. There was a lot of folks upset at the way decisions were made during the lockdowns. I think, again, this is a question of constitutional importance that should be considered as an amendment to clarify something that clearly judges disagree. So while I think the outcome was what most people would support, this is an effort to make sure that doesn't happen again.
Okay, Jan, it seemed as though when I was reading between the lines on the Budget Project analysis, it was a question of whether or not this amendment was actually needed, or if y'all thought the current protections in the state and federal constitutions plus in state law covered this already from your perspective. Is that an accurate reflection?
That's right. And I think this is, and I don't disagree with Daniel, and we did not take a position on this. A couple of the themes here, there's a lot of the amendments here that were driven by headlines and news items. And one of the complaints you always hear about constitutional amendments is that there's too many kind of picayune items that don't belong in the Constitution. This actually is something that probably should be decided at the ballot box. But again, the Supreme Court did weigh in on this. It is a real interesting question about what the rights of government should be to protect public health versus the right of worship. I think the court has come in pretty squarely on the right of people to assemble in church. And I think what this would simply do is if this kind of thing happens again, let's hope we don't have another pandemic or similar public health emergency, that it would expedite any kind of legal questions and bring that straight to the Supreme Court is my reading of this. So this is, I suspect, I don't want to predict what voters will do, but this was certainly driven by a renegade pastor out in Central, Tony Spell. If those in Baton Rouge remember him defying the stay-at-home restrictions, and obviously we had a big public debate during and after COVID about lockdowns, and that's what this grew out of. And but I think this is something voters need to weigh in on.
Barry, anything you want to add to this discussion?
I would just say briefly, I mean, we didn't take a position because I'm fairly certain voters can be pretty supportive of it. But, I will say, we already have some protections besides the Constitution, also in statute. And actually what the court did was basically follow the track or the game plan, whatever, that this amendment spells out. So everything this amendment says the court should do, they have already done, and they've set that precedent. Sure, there were some dissenting opinions here and there along the way, but there are always dissenting opinions when you have a bunch of appellate court judges and all that. That's how things get to the Supreme Court. That's just the natural order of things. So we didn't take a position. I think we feel like it's got a lot of language in there that does to me sound a lot like statutory language. It seems like it could have been streamlined a little bit more than it was, but I think voters are probably going to be pretty supportive of it, and so we just kind of let them make that decision.
Okay, let's move on to Amendment 3, Stephen's favorite subject, retirement.
That's exactly right. In one sense, this is a relatively easy amendment. Basically, when there's a surplus at the end of the year, it is limited by the Constitution to only be spent in certain things: construction, paying down bond debt, coastal funding, rainy day, and retirement debt. In fact, retirement debt has a mandatory 10% that has to pay down on a certain segment of retirement debt, often known UAL. This would move that requirement to 25%. So from 10% to 25% paying down retirement debt. And there's also is a concern that the current Constitution basically wouldn't have that 10% anymore after 2028, 2029, when this one little segment goes away. And the current amendment, or the proposed amendment, would actually have that indefinitely while we still have retirement debt. So basically increasing from 10 to 25%. One quick graph, just to let you know, we have about $17 billion in state retirement debt. That's not including like local retirement debt or statewide, like firefighter systems. It's these state systems, so teachers, state employees, school employees, and state police, with the bulk of it being teachers and school and state employees. So plenty to talk about here. Simple amendment. I'm curious what our panel has to say.
Jan, I'm going to start with you on this one, just because it was your turn.
Okay, well, it is a simple amendment, and we did not take a formal position on this, but I think, we in the last few years, we've been running surpluses in state government, and the Constitution very correctly says that these are one-time dollars that should be spent on one-time things. But there needs to be a little bit of discretion given to the legislature to respond to the needs of the day. So certainly retirement debt is an issue, a problem. But a couple of things I think we need to note is, number one, these are constitutional obligations of the state. So if you vote for this amendment, you're not doing anything to protect anybody's retirement, because if you're a teacher or a state employee, you're going to get the retirement that you've earned. Certainly in good times, the legislature should consider doing this, but the needs of the state, this year at the legislature, retirement became a big deal for conservatives. Every few years, it seems to bubble up as a big issue in Baton Rouge, but coastal protection is another big issue. Road and bridge backlogs are a big issue. And I think if you are going to prescribe this along with the rainy day fund, then you're going to say that when we have surplus money, 50 cents of that dollar should automatically come off the top before we talk about whether we should put money towards any of these other very important long-term needs. So one of the complaints you often hear is that there is too much money locked away and that there's too many restrictions placed on the legislature to make decisions about the public purse. I think this would make that problem worse. So it's not that they shouldn't put money towards retirement, it's that they shouldn't be obligated to put a certain amount every year when there might be different crises to address in the future that we can't predict today.
Okay, so the budget project didn't take a position, but Jan just did the opposition argument very well. And I know both the Pelican Institute and Cable have taken positions of support in favor of this amendment. So Daniel, let me start with you to explain why y'all are in favor of this one.
Yeah, this was an easy support for us as it moved through the legislature, and certainly now on the ballot. Believe it or not, I agree with some of what Jan said there, and we have long advocated to free up, and we'll talk about this actually in the November set of ballots. But free up dedicated funds and give more flexibility for lawmakers to represent the priorities of the day, and I still believe that's very, very important and very true in the general operating budget of the state. The question is when there are one-time dollars that exist because of growth in the economy or whatever the reason may be. This makes a lot of sense, and it still gives lawmakers a lot of flexibility over half of those dollars. As Stephen mentioned at the setup, we already mandate that 10% go. This does two things, as Stephen mentioned. One is it increases that to 25. And second is that it does free up or at least clarify that obligation to continue to pay down debt extends beyond the initial UAL that is currently in the language of the requirement. Look, all of these things are important, and my hope is that we take a much bigger swing at addressing pension reform here in Louisiana in the next couple of years. This is a crisis for the state that Jan mentions comes up every couple of years. I hope it comes up every year. This is a major and significant threat to the operations of our state, to our workers, to everyone else. So this is something we have to take a big look at. In the meantime, freeing up pension debt frees up dollars down the road to do all those things Jan mentions. It frees up dollars to invest in infrastructure, to invest in other one-time or ongoing support. This eats up just in the basic operations of the state. Pension debt is eating up $1 billion a year in payments that most people don't see because they're buried or part of appropriations that go to pay for staff at various agencies or through those retirement systems that Stephen put in his excellent chart. So this one's really important to make sure we can free up future resources, that we can pay down obligations of debt that threaten to cause significant financial harm to the state and crowd out really important programs down the road if we don't handle this now. We've got to quit kicking the can down the road, address it now. This is one tool in the toolbox that allows us to do that. That should set up, hopefully, a much larger conversation about reform that we're well overdue to have.
Okay, Barry, your turn. I guess we should note here that right now we are having hefty surpluses over and over, but that's not certain to be on the horizon long term. So it's unclear how much money will actually end up going to the retirement debt out of this amendment. But walk us through Cable's perspective on this one.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot to add to what Daniel said. Honestly, I think, from our perspective, you could argue it both ways, because do you want to put this, constraint or this requirement in the Constitution or just let legislators each year figure out how much of that they want to go there. We opted on the side of doing it. The 25% in the rainy day fund makes sense. 25%, it seems to us, towards this huge retirement debt also seems to make sense. And, I think we just weighed in really for the reasons that Daniel said too, that it just makes good long-term sense.
Okay, thank you. Before we move on to Amendment 4, I just want to remind anybody watching that if you have a question about a specific amendment, when we're on that amendment, please drop the question in the Q&A or the chat box.
All righty. Amendment 4, this is the last of the October 14 amendments, and then we'll go on to November after this. This one is with nonprofit tax exemptions, particularly when they have housing. So nonprofits get a property tax exemption, and then this proposes that if those nonprofits that lease property have a violation that endangers public health, that they could lose that. Specifically, if they have 3 or more code violations from this list that I put up. It's not any code violation. It's not you didn't mow the lawn or something like that. It's injurious or toxic ventilation. Your roof is leaking rain, hazardous electrical systems, improper connection of fuel burning appliances. So major violations of health and safety. You'd have to have 3 of those in a 12-month period, and the governing authority of the parish would also have to agree at that point. And with plenty of pros and cons and history behind this one, but that's an overall statement. This wouldn't be mandatory. Again, it's up to the governing authority, and it would be these particular code violations that would get you in trouble.
Okay, Barry, I think Cable is the only organization that took a position on this specific amendment about blighted property. So can you walk us through the position that Cable took?
Yeah, I mean, we support it. And honestly, this is one of those things that kind of continually happens where you kind of wish you didn't have to have a constitutional amendment to address an issue that folks feel like need to be addressed. But I think the bottom line, some of the background is it came out of New Orleans, but really it applies statewide. There's some properties down there that have been in the news, really deplorable conditions that tenants are in. For whatever reason, the local authorities didn't feel like they had the tools that they needed to be able to try and address the situation with that particular landlord. And the nonprofit status kind of entered into trying to get one of the tools that they wanted with putting these back on the tax roll and maybe doing some other things with a sheriff's sale or auction, whatever. That's their strategy. But the bottom line, I think this is, it is a local problem. Property taxes are local taxes, but they're all in the state constitution. Authorities at the local level, even though it's their local property tax, have very little leeway one way or the other to make adjustments, certainly not provide exemptions or do anything without changing the Constitution. I think that's unfortunate that that's the way our Constitution is, with all that language on property taxes in the Constitution. But, at the end of the day, if a local government feels that this is something that would help them, assist them in dealing with issues in their community, I think they ought to be able to do that. And again, it applies statewide, but really the focus of this one is particularly in New Orleans.
Okay, I know that I guess I'm just going to explain the argument against in case no one else is inclined to do so on this particular one. I think that the arguments that we've heard against this one are that the code enforcement violations can be subjective and that local governing officials could make sort of case-by-case decisions on these very valuable property tax breaks, and perhaps politics can flow into those decisions. So, Jan, did the Budget Project have any concerns about this amendment? I know y'all didn't take a position on it.
No, and I think Barry's exactly right. I mean, this was another constitutional amendment that was driven, in this case, by a TV news investigation into a particularly bad landlord in the New Orleans area, which who happened to be a religious organization based in Tennessee. So you had this kind of almost perfect villain in this news story, and there were some real deplorable conditions. And as Barry said, this has to be settled in the Constitution because that's where the original underlying law sits. And we could probably have an hour-long conversations about reforming property taxes and exemptions, because it really is one of the main tools that local governments have to raise money. And that's it. But we exempt a lot of property from taxation from corporations and individuals. And that's a broader discussion. This just gets to a tiny, tiny little piece of this. And again, it applies statewide. It's permissive. It doesn't require anybody to any local government to take those property to tax these jurisdictions. If a landlord complies and fixes the problems, then they get their property tax break back. So, but again, I think however folks vote on this, that speaks to the larger need to really rethink property taxes in general, I think. But that's a larger conversation, and it's not addressed by this.
Right. That's its own webinar, and we'll have you back for that one, I promise.
Yeah. If it's only an hour-long conversation, we'd be lucky.
Yeah.
Daniel, do you want to wade into this one?
I'll do it briefly. I think I'd agree with a lot of what's been said. I think the concern with this one is it's pretty specifically targeted, and as Jan mentioned, around one particular instance. It's true that to address it has to be addressed in the Constitution. Again, speaks to the broader challenges with why we need constitutional reform in Louisiana. I think if this were, to Jan's point, a broadly applied change to the balance of state and local power, this is one we might have a lot more interest in. The other part of this is, as you mentioned, Melinda, is code enforcement can be a pretty political thing. This feels like, on one hand, a tool to solve a problem that really exists. On another hand, a tool in the hands of a pretty political process to begin with. It could be wielded as much for bad as it is for good. And again, it puts government officials in the position of picking winners and losers in the economy. So in terms of all tax policy, right, we prefer tax policy that's broadly based, that is applicable to everyone with as few exemptions and changes as possible. This at one hand strikes against that, which is why we certainly, I feel like the character on The Princess Bride, I clearly cannot choose the cup in front of me. This is on one hand why we can't support it, but again, it does address a significant need and something that does have to be done in the Constitution. So I suspect, again, not sharing Jan's crystal ball, I suspect this will maybe pretty confusing to voters as they go into the booth.
Right,
Just to clarify, because we said a couple times, if you want to address it using the method of removing the tax exemption, it has to be a Constitution. Because other people that we've talked to have said, well, you can address blight and through other methods completely. So that's
Absolutely.
a clarification. All right, are we done? Are we ready to move on to November?
Let's move to November's ballot.
All right.
All right, so November 18th, just when you think it was safe to go back in the voting booth. So here's the ballot language for this one. This one is complicated and technical. You can read that. My quick summary is that it changes and updates the vetoes and how vetoes are done. A little bit of background on this one. We've always had the ability, or the legislature's always had the ability to have a veto session. So not actually, they can override vetoes during a session if the time limits permit, or if it's after the session, there will be a veto session that will be called unless one half of one chamber says, no, we're not interested. And that is what has always happened until recently. So until recently, in the last couple of years, we have never had, since the 1974 Constitution, a veto override session. So until we started, we didn't know exactly what the issues were. So we had it, and it turns out if you have, say, a special session, and there was a veto that happened there, and then you look and have the veto session, and it falls during the regular session or a different session, no one was exactly sure how to handle that. If you had to adjourn the regular session and come back, or if you had to, basically you could handle it during the session. So they kind of had a rule and moved on with it. So the question here is, it would allow them to address vetoes, to have a veto override vote during the actual session, as opposed to calling a special veto session. And it does some other things with timing, but those are probably the most important thing that it does.
Okay, so this is about veto bill deadlines and veto sessions and other sessions.
Y'all speak up on your clarifications. I'd love to hear it.
So this is about the fact that we have a lot of special sessions and a lot of veto sessions now. To sum up quickly, Jan, let me start with you in terms of where you think this should go. I know the Budget Project didn't really take a position on this one. Obviously, it's a point of legal clarification because there are a lot of legal disagreements about how things have been handled so far.
Well, Melinda, one of the reasons we may not have released our November recommendations yet is because we're still trying to figure some of these things out. And I want to congratulate you for doing an admirably wonderful job of explaining this, you and Stephen, in your guide. This is an amendment that only a real just government geek could love. And we're all government geeks on this panel. But I also don't think it's going to affect day-to-day life in Louisiana for anybody who's not in the legislature or happens to be the governor. I think as I read this, it basically says that if the legislature is in session and they want to consider a veto from a previous session, then they don't have to go to the trouble of adjourning, convening a new session, just to hold one vote and then going back into their regular session. So it's probably a good idea. But again, I think this is, again, one of those things that voters have a right to be confused, and voters have a right to wonder why it's in the Constitution. But people much smarter than me have decided that that's how it needs to be. So I'm glad we're clarifying this, because it seems like we're going to have more vetoes and override votes, or at least we have had recently than certainly in the last 40 years prior to this administration.
Right. I look forward to seeing how voters react when they read this language in the ballot booth. Barry, Cable took a position in support of this amendment. So can you walk us through why?
Well, we haven't officially done that yet, but we
Oh,
probably.
I'm sorry. I thought y'all had supported this one already.
No, that's that bunch we haven't put out our stuff on yet. Yeah. I mean, I think we will support it. And, to
Breaking
your point
news, cable support.
Yeah, the world's been waiting. Well, to your point about the ballot language being confusing, the only thing more confusing than the ballot language is the language in the amendment itself. So I would recommend people not to go back and read the ballot. I mean, not just the ballot language, but the amendment itself, because that's even more confusing. So that's why they should go to one of the guides that people are putting out. I mean, the bottom line, I think the simple explanation is, yeah, they got themselves between a rock and a hard place with this veto session while the legislature was already in session. And then it scratched my head. What do I do? Is it going to be totally legal to adjourn and do whatever we did? They did. They adjourned briefly. They took the vote, came back in. But if somebody had challenged it legally, who knows where it might have gone, because the language in the Constitution, can certainly be looked at in different ways than people have. So it's probably a good idea out of a clarification point of view to actually do this and kind of get that issue off the table. So I think we probably will end up supporting it.
Okay, Daniel. So, I mean, it seems like the framers of the Constitution probably didn't envision how many sessions we were going to have in a single term, and that's what this is about. So where is Pelican on this one?
Yeah, we'll be officially neutral on it, but I would agree. I think this is probably, if we look at the qualifications, is this something that's already addressed or should be addressed by the Constitution? Yes, I think so. And it does clarify, as Barry said, what was a really confusing few days in the last couple of years, trying to figure out exactly what the Constitution directed lawmakers to do and how to handle that situation. Now, one does wonder if in fact we end up in a term with a Republican governor and a Republican supermajority legislature, whether this will actually end up getting tested in the next few years. But again, constitutional change is intended to set up the future of government, not just the political situation in front of us. So, I think this is incredibly, as you know, confusing. That may have a hard time getting voters to support it, but I think it's a change that's necessary to clarify, what lawmakers do in that situation, so we don't have lawsuits and other debates if that situation emerges again. I think all of us hope there are fewer special sessions in general, and again, we'll see if we even have a veto session in the next few years.
I think a couple gubernatorial candidates are talking about special sessions already. So I don't think you're getting your wish, but maybe we won't have as many veto sessions.
I'm trying to pretend that doesn't.
Okay, moving on to Amendment 2.
All right. So this one is a pretty long one in terms of the ballot language, but it's actually relatively simple. There are 20-something plus funds in the Constitution. Depends on who's counting and what their criteria is. This amendment would eliminate 6 inactive funds. And it's probably easier just to go to the next page. So there's the funds that are getting removed. And you can see the Chaffalot Basin Fund, the Help Fund, Millennium Leverage Fund, the Seafood Fund, the First Use, and the Life Fund. So these have either never been used or haven't been touched in 10 years. They don't have any money in them except for the Life Fund, which has a little over $600. So essentially, this is a cleanup measure It says, look, we're not using funds. We're trying to trim down the Constitution. Hey, let's start here. And I'm curious to see what everyone thinks about this one.
Yes, legislators are going to go on a spending spree with that $600 that would get transferred to the state general fund if this passes.
They probably haven't because they didn't know about it. That's the only reason. But
and to be clear, the life fund, the last time it was used was, more than 20 years ago, for what that's worth. Daniel, let's start with you on this one. Is Pelican planning to take a position on this one?
Yeah, we support this amendment. As I mentioned earlier, as a general rule, we want to free up and eliminate constitutional and statutory dedications for the state's operating fund. The Constitution currently contains 36 dedicated funds. When the Constitution was ratified in 1974, it had 2. So the way I kind of think about this is, this is tying the hands of lawmakers, especially ones that we don't use, right, are easy to move. I wish it were more expansive, honestly. These dedicated funds basically lock in the priorities from lawmakers from ages past and restrict the ability for current lawmakers to reflect priorities of today. Imagine trying to run your home budget or your small business budget on priorities from 20 or 30 years ago. We spend money on different things today than we did then. That's true for our personal budgets, and that's true for government. And these are just legacy, basically, funds of lawmakers from, again, ages past who had a priority and wanted to lock it up. So the fact that these don't have any money in them, they're not used, is a pretty simple cleanup measure. Again, I fear the ballot language may confuse people, given the list of them there, but hopefully we can all come together and say this is an easy one to clean up, and then let's keep working on freeing up more of those dedicated funds in the future.
And of course, to play devil's advocate, I guess the argument against this amendment is that legislators might want to use these funds for their purposes at some point in the future.
It also makes my point about why we should remove them.
Jan,
y'all sound like you almost cooperated on that one. That was punch.
Jan, is the Budget Project taking a position on this one?
Not formally. I mean, I was delighted to discover that there was $604 sitting around in a fund that Bobby Jindal didn't sweep during the last administration. No, this seems like a no-brainer. I think this is, I know Parr was involved in this, and rightly so. It's not a budget project issue, but it certainly makes sense to clean up the Constitution. I think this is one of those amendments that speaks to the issue that the Constitution is too convoluted and complex, and there's a lot of stuff in there that probably doesn't belong in the state's founding charter. So I'm glad this is on the ballot. And if we were in the business of taking positions on things that like this that aren't central to our mission, we would probably support it. And on an individual basis, I think it's great.
Barry, I'm going to not scoop you on this one. Does Cable have a position on this amendment?
Well, I think we will be supportive of it. I'll just say, to echo everybody, this is kind of the celebration amendment, because every time we're sitting here talking about amendments, just about, we're putting new things in the Constitution. This is the first time I can think of we're taking something out. So that's woohoo.
That we need to frame that. So, okay. All right. Amendment 3. Let's see if there's such agreement on this one. All right. So we're on Amendment 3. This is relatively short amendment. It basically adds an additional property tax exemption for emergency or first responders. So there's a $75,000 homestead exemption that people get. This would add an optional up to $25,000 additional exemption for homeowners who are first responders like fire, police, emergency service, emergency medical response, EMS. So it would add that. It wouldn't have to be the whole $25,000. Each local authority could choose what they wanted to do, and it could be $10,000. It could be any amount. So it is permissive.
Okay, so this one, the way it was described in the legislature, this is mainly about recruitment of police officers. There are some shortages in those areas. And on this one, I'm going to start with, let's go with Barry this time. You were last time you said woohoo. So let's see if you have enthusiasm about this one.
Yeah, woohoo. There's another one of these particular kind of amendments. I mean, honestly, we see these just about every single year. And, you know, I think they're all very well intentioned. So I don't really want to talk negatively about what they're trying to do and who they're trying to assist. But I think the issue is we see these every year. They kind of continue to, you know, in some ways erode the tax base, even though they're not large numbers of people necessarily. Although first responders, that's a pretty large number, a group of people within any parish, any jurisdiction. That could have an impact on budgets if local governments chose to do that. But, you know, again, this is another one of those things where property taxes are in the Constitution to allow this. You know, we have to have a constitutional amendment to do it. You know, we're not taking a position on it because we know people tend to be very supportive of these things. But I would say one of the issues that also comes up, you know, routinely with some of these types of things is, you know, there are people that are counted and are left in, and then there are other first responders that don't make the cut a lot of times because there's a lot of different varieties of people who are first responders, and a lot of times they, you know, these amendments aren't always explicit as to who they are. Just as with individuals, you know, with other kinds of work. Even with veteran groups and things like that. So we're not taking a position, but we just want to point out this is just kind of another proliferation of these exemptions that are at least potentially being added at somewhat potentially some cost to local governments.
Right. And that's the argument against, obviously, that is that one local governing authority can determine if they're collecting property taxes from people that affect a large array of services and programs. And obviously, property taxes are one of the ways that local governments have access to any money. Daniel, is Pelican taking a position on this one?
No, we don't have a formal position. Obviously, you know, as Barry mentioned, the impetus for this, I think, you know, there would be a lot of support. It's, you know, supporting our law enforcement, being able to add a tool to the toolbox to help recruit good men and women to join law enforcement and first responders where we have significant talent needs, particularly in our urban areas. And that's a really important issue. The problem, again, as Barry mentioned, is we're adding another exemption into the tax code. And that goes against that principle of fair, flat, even, low, broad tax base, right? And, you know, it's just a reminder for folks listening, if you exempt one class or one group of people to raise the same amount of money to fund government, then you have to raise taxes somewhere else down the line. So that's why, again, we support low, flat, and broad as a basic principle of this. So as Barry mentioned, this adds to things like veterans, income level, senior citizens, individuals with physical disabilities into an existing list of exemptions. We would prefer, again, to not have a growing list. We want a shrinking list, and that allows everybody to benefit from lower rates and a flatter system. You know, the other thing, again, I'll mention maybe on the positive side is it's permissive and not a requirement. I think that is a good thing in the way it's structured. Overall, I think we should be skeptical of using the tax code in this way as a tool, though we should look for lots of ways to give local governments the ability to recruit good men and women to join law enforcement and support our law enforcement officers.
Okay, that kind of sounds like Pelican's taking a position. So we're going to move on to the final amendment.
Wait, I don't get to talk about this one?
Jan, sorry, feel free to talk.
Yeah, I just want to, I mean, I think I agree with Barry that this is very well intentioned. And certainly I think law enforcement needs to, you know, we need to do what we can to help law enforcement. But yeah, local government is very constrained in how it can raise revenue. They basically have property taxes and sales taxes. And in most jurisdictions in the state, they're maxed out on sales tax. We have some of the highest combined sales tax rates in the country. And so when you erode the property tax base, you make it a lot harder to fund government services in whatever community chooses to do this. And if we want to pay first responders more money, we should pay them more money. And we do that, and we have bizarre ways of doing this in Louisiana. You know, we have in the Constitution that we pay, you know, monthly stipends to every single, you know, deputy sheriff in Louisiana. No other state does that. And now we want to use the tax code to fix this problem that really should be fixed at the local level. And I would also say, what about first responders who rent, which would probably apply to the ones who are the lowest paid? A senior level police officer with overtime could make a very good middle class income, but the person who works on the EMT who works on an ambulance probably gets paid very little and may not have the resources to buy a home in New Orleans or some in Baton Rouge, and probably would not benefit from this. So I think you run the risk, if this were to pass, of helping the people who are already doing better and not really helping the people who are at the bottom of the income scale, who really need some help and really need to be paid more for the critical work that they do. So I don't expect we'll take a formal position, and I know this is very well intentioned, but we just need to pay people who do important public services, whether that's first responder, police officer, fire, EMT, teachers, need to be paid more, but this is probably the wrong approach.
Okay,
that's the end of my rant.
Since everybody actually took an opposing position, even though y'all officially didn't take a position, I'm just going to explain that the argument that supporters give for this is that it's one tool in the toolbox. There are lots of things they're trying to do to recruit first responders, but they think this would be a valid way to help draw police, firefighters, EMS workers, all those things they have shortages in, to their areas and try and help them. So
basically,
now we're gonna.
That's what I heard.
Now we're going to move on to the fourth and final one, and I promise I will not let anybody go without talking about it. So, Stephen Gluck explaining this one.
Yeah, that's a pretty weighty threat. This, remember, we didn't choose the ballot order; the legislature did, and the Secretary of State. And so this is saving the most difficult one for last. This is the ballot language. This is rough. So I need to break down a couple of things for everyone listening. So this is the Revenue Stabilization Fund. This is not the Budget Stabilization Fund, which is also known as the Rainy Day Fund. So that exists to take essentially minimal revenue off the top when we have good years and put it in there and save it for when we have a rainy day or there's a budget shortfall. This is the Revenue Stabilization Fund. It could get some minimal revenue, but mostly it gets it. It was established in 2016. Any corporate revenue, corporate income, or franchise tax over $600 million will flow into this fund. So that's how money gets in there. Then in the current law, what happens? If you hit $5 billion, then you can spend 10% of that on construction. That mostly doesn't change. I mean, a little bit, but mostly doesn't change. Also, with a 2/3 vote, the legislature can tap the fund for an emergency, but they don't define what emergency means. So essentially, they can use it for any purpose with a 2/3 vote. There's about, $2.2 billion in the fund, Melinda? Is that right?
Yes.
There's about $2.2 billion in the fund now. And it could grow depending on corporate revenue. This amendment, it does a lot of little things, but the biggest thing it probably does is it takes away that 2/3 vote and says, okay, look, you can no longer, with a 2/3 vote, tap this for any purpose by calling it an emergency. However, it will give you the ability to help fill budget holes. If after a budget shortfall, you reach into the rainy day fund, and the rainy day fund, the amount you pull out from there is not enough or sufficient to deal with that budget hole, then you can take another $250 million from the Revenue Stabilization Fund to help as well. So it's, in one way, that one particular mechanism serves as kind of a backup rainy day fund. But you still also have the, when you get $5 billion, you can spend it on roads and bridges. That is a very high level overview of a complicated amendment. And I can't wait to hear what other context y'all have on this one.
I feel like I want to ask if there are any volunteers who want to start this one off. It is very complicated. Legislators owe voters an apology, I think, about this one. But who wants to take this one first?
I'm happy to start. Thanks.
First man on deck. I love it.
This, as you say, this feels a little like just typical of the Louisiana tax and budget process. It's all incredibly complex, so on the downside, this adds complexity to the process. It's hard to understand, and it does, potentially tie the hands in some ways of lawmakers when there are pretty broad rules around this right now. The fact that this whole fund exists separate from the rainy day fund is another added complexity to the process, and because we've had a really strong few years of as corporate tax rates have increased and deductions and some of the carve outs have come down, this fund has boomed. In fact, I know 2.2 billion is the official balance. There was some talk that it may be closer to 3 billion here in the very near term. It's a substantial amount of money. On the plus side, the complexity exists already. And this is an area where there weren't very many rules. There was a lot of uncertainty about exactly how this could be used. There's some argument that would have allowed the lawmakers to basically drain the whole thing, and this at least puts some constraint around that and does what it's intended to do, which is to provide an additional step of stability, even if it's incredibly complex, to the rainy day fund or the budget stabilization fund. And if I had a nickel for every time our team corrected me from calling them the wrong name, budget stabilization versus revenue stabilization, we probably could have funded a whole new fund. So this is something even, nerds often struggle to maybe y'all struggle less than this nerd does, but to get our heads wrapped around. Again, I think voters are going to have a really challenging time understand this. I hope they read the PAR guide and everybody else's to know what they're getting into when they head into the ballot box. I think on net, we'll be officially neutral. I think on net, despite the complexity, despite just a challenge to understand what it's exactly accomplishing, I think it's probably put some structure where it didn't exist before. And again, sort of makes clear what the point of this is.
And it seems like currently it's pretty easy to raid this fund and just drain it entirely. This adds new steps that make it harder to just drain this fund entirely. Although arguably there are still a lot of exceptions that can be used with 2/3 votes. So Jan, is the Budget Project going to take a position on this one?
Probably not. And I think, Daniel gave a good explanation, and you too, Melinda. I think the way I read this, it makes it a little harder to tap this new rainy day fund. I think we need to, first of all, step back and just kind of congratulate policymakers for how much money they have socked away during these past 8 years. We used to have about $250 million in the rainy day fund, a little bit over that at its low point after the Jindal years. And we now have well over 10 times that amount socked away in these 2 rainy day funds. And the new one really got us away from this volatility that we always saw in corporate tax collections. Corporate tax collections would swing by $1 billion sometimes year to year because of the way large corporations can depreciate and take various deductions. And so now, and when there's a strong year in corporate tax collections, it goes into this new rainy day fund. We've all seen some of these various funds in state governments get bled dry when the state has financial problems, like it did in the years after the Great Recession. And I think this is a way to make it a little harder to do that. But I also think, the alternative is when the state does run shortfalls, we still need to pay teachers. We still need to take care of people who fall on hard times. And so the legislature, I think, should have some flexibility to tap into these funds, these savings accounts, when we fall on hard times, because there are a lot of people in this state who struggle day to day. And if the alternative, if the money is sitting there and we're looking at big cuts to critical services, my preference would be for the legislature to have a little bit of flexibility to address those.
Okay, Barry, you get the last word on this one.
Oh, lucky me.
Barry, explain all the things that we didn't catch.
No, well, it's not that. I mean, you're right. It's very complicated. And, you know, we haven't taken a position yet. I would say we have some concerns about it. I mean, first, I think it does something that's really important, and it does sort of put a cap on how much money that can be taken out of the fund. So as other people say, you can't just drain it. And I think that's positive. But on the other hand, it just really makes it into rainy day fund part 2 for the most part. There are exceptions to that. But for the most part, it's rainy day fund part 2, which means for the most part, you can only use it for budget deficits. And one of the things we've learned, you know, I think recently in the last few years, and especially looking around at some of the other issues we've had with, you know, climate change related issues, hurricanes, storms, you know, fires, everything. I mean, there are other expenses that could be emergency expenses that we might want to have a savings account available to help use. I use one example during COVID when we lost all the money out of the unemployment trust fund. We were going to have to pay all of that back through new taxes if, thank goodness, we had all this federal money that did it instead. But if we didn't had all that federal money, we would have had to raise taxes on businesses to pay that type of thing back. That would be something that the legislature might legitimately want to look at as a fund to use, you know, to help, you know, mitigate that issue. But under this kind of a theory, I don't think you'd be able to do that. So bottom line is, I think it does some good things. I think for us, we feel like legislators probably need to go back to the drawing board, come back next year with something that's a little bit more, I guess, thought out and more, you know, broader thinking that can accomplish the protections and the constraints that people want, but also providing, again, some flexibility for other circumstances besides only a budget deficit.
Okay, we survived, everyone.
I want to thank all of y'all. You know, I don't want to say you made constitutional amendments fun, but you made it as fun as you can make it. So I enjoyed the discussion with y'all. Thank you so much. Everyone had a great context that they added in discussion. I really appreciate it. I hope this was useful for everyone that's watching online. Reminder, this will be on our YouTube page, and we will send the link out to everyone on as well, all of our members and followers. Thank y'all so much. I really appreciate it. I urge everyone to go out there and vote for on the constitutional amendments and follow, if not our guide, one of the other people that are on here to get educated, and share it with your friends, neighbors, coworkers, just so they can be educated as well. Thank y'all so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.